So I am delighted to introduce Henry Copeland to our Therapy Works podcast. And maybe, Henry, you want to introduce yourself first and maybe even start with what the greatest challenge is that you are facing.
Okay, so I'm 43. I live in Cornwall with my little dog. He may well bark. Apologies for that. And my greatest challenge that I'm facing at the moment is not having children as a single woman. And for me, the road is over. So I'm facing permanent childlessness. I'm no longer hoping to meet somebody and have a miracle baby. I'm just trying to accept future without children.
Gosh, as I heard you say that, the kind of permanent childlessness, and I'm no longer hoping the road is over, I imagine that getting to there's been quite a kind of roller coaster of roads of hoping and then being disappointed and hoping and disappointed. Do you want to tell us about that, if that's the case?
So for me, it was really important to me to have a partner to have children with. I didn't want to do it on my own. I think I could have done it on my own. I'm a perfectly capable woman. But I wanted my children to have a father that was around to love them and raise them with me. So for me, the sort of the roller coaster of hope and disappointment came in either meeting and hoping people or not meeting them and feeling disappointed. So I was in a relationship in my early 20s with a man who I hoped to marry and have children with. It was a long distance relationship in the end, so it didn't work out. And after that, there was a bit of a drought for many, many years. And I did meet somebody in my late 30s. Nothing really happened. I think it's probably what you would describe as an emotional affair. He was going through a messy divorce. I was in my late 30s and thinking, I don't want to jump on this poor guy just because he could be a potential source of sperm, basically. I wanted to be sure.
Donor.
Yeah, it's not fair on him. It's not ideal. We hung out a lot and it was great. And I really thought things were going to happen with him. And then they suddenly didn't because another woman just magically appeared on the scene. So that sort of ended that little stream of hope. And I think I overreacted to that emotionally, and I couldn't really understand why. I couldn't understand why I felt so devastated that it hadn't worked out with him. And that sort of became clear over the next few months. And I think it was 3 months later, I had what I can only describe as a grief attack in the shower.
Yeah.
And I suddenly just knew my children weren't coming.
Oh, Henry. A grief attack in the shower. So it's like it hit you like a storm in your body and a kind of a blast of grief of the reality. I'm going to be childless. I'm never going to have a child.
Yeah, it was like a deep knowing. And it was that moment, the moment you see in movies when somebody's loved one gets hit by a bus in front of them and they fall to their knees. It was that moment for me. I was on my knees and then I was in the fetal position for I don't know how long. And I rather foolishly thought, oh, well, that's good. I've cried it all out now. I'll be fine. I don't have to have children. But that was just the start.
I'll live with that.
Yeah.
It was the start. I really want to go forward, but there's this question in my mind that I need to go back before I go forward with you, which is more about me than you, is that drought from your kind of mid-20s to your late 30s. Do you have an understanding of what that was about? That you had no relationships or none that were kind of committed or satisfying or that felt like a drought?
No, I didn't have any relationships. I do have an idea, but I think this is always the case. There's no one reason. It's many, many reasons. And the key reason at the end of all of it is I just didn't meet a guy who I thought, oh yeah, I like him, and he's not married, and he's looking, and we're in the same country. I just didn't meet that person in that time. But I do.
So some of that is just random luck, isn't it? Life is our intention and our wanting and our kind of having a picture of what we want, and that influences us. And probably 50% of life is out of our control, that we have no control over. And you never found the man who is single, who wanted a committed relationship, who you were in the same country at the same time, who liked you enough or loved you enough or wanted to make a relationship with you, and you both wanted the same thing at the same time.
Yeah, and crucially, I didn't find anybody that I wanted to be with. I was like, he's all right, not up to much. So there's that. There's a random chance. There's also, I remember making a promise to myself after the first relationship ended that I wasn't going to be with another guy unless it was the final guy I was going to be with forever. It was really important to me, and I think I made that promise, and I didn't revisit that until my mid-30s. And I was like, oh, I just remembered I made that promise. Oh, I'm undoing that. And then I felt much more open to men then.
Gosh.
But
Because that's quite a promise, isn't it? That's
yeah,
like keeping the door half shut,
yeah,
isn't it?
yeah. And that was just I was heartbroken and I didn't really know how to deal with it
Yeah.
sort of way. I was in my early
Yeah.
20s. I didn't know anything.
Yeah. I just don't want to feel like this again. I don't want to be left
Yeah,
again.
yeah. But yeah, I did open the doors again in my mid 30s because I was really desperate to meet somebody to have children with. So I was doing a lot of work on myself, as we all do. But I also have my values to live by, and I just I can't put over hours of my life to swiping left or right on men who are taking selfies of themselves in the bathroom mirror to show their tattooed torso when I could be out growing my vegetables with my dog digging by my side or meeting friends for a barbecue on the beach. I can't. Life's too precious, isn't it? So that's my choice, and that's okay.
Yeah. So, like you said, it does feel like there were lots of aspects of what got you to be in that shower at that time when it suddenly hit you like a storm. Some of it was your attitude and a kind of conscious decision that you'd made. Some of it was your values. Some of it was luck. Some of it was things beyond all of our control. And also something about the dating culture of swiping just didn't fit with you, but it is how often people now connect, isn't it? Rather than
Yeah,
on the beach with somebody.
yeah, yeah.
And so you said that moment was the beginning of a grieving process. You hoped it would be it, like I'm fine now, but that wasn't the case.
I really honestly thought that the next morning everything would be fine. Yeah, it took a few weeks, and just remember walking through the woods where I live and thinking, God, this is really weird. I feel like someone's died. I feel grief. What is going on with that? And eventually I was Googling, can you grieve children that you never had?
Yes.
And apparently you can. It's a thing. It's a
I mean,
real
you're
thing.
laughing, but I imagine you really feel such deep and profound sadness as well as laughing.
Yeah. It got deeper and deeper and worse over. I'm 4 years in now, and I would say that year one was hard and surprising, and I didn't understand what was really happening. Year two was awful. I can feel how awful it was.
Can you tell me a bit about that? How awful year two was? What was so awful?
It's the most alienated I've ever felt.
Yeah.
Um, at the point that I was coming to terms with not having children and feeling all this grief, people were waving their scans in my face.
Oh, Henry.
And they didn't always realise what they were doing. And I think often they thought that I could be excited for them because they knew how much I longed for my own children. So I would understand how relieved they were.
Oh my goodness.
Um,
Gosh.
yeah, it was just really hard to talk about. Because I was only, I was 40 by this point. Because I was 40, I still had time. And so that every time I tried to talk about it, they would shut me down with, well, you've still got time. Or why don't you just adopt? Or, oh, this is my favourite. Oh, just go to the pub, get wasted, find a bloke, you'll be pregnant by the end of the night, job done. And that was given as a serious suggestion. And I was like, okay, so you're trying to talk about this really deep loss and this grief that you can't go backwards with. Like once those doors were open for me, there was nothing I could do to crawl out of grief again and go back to hoping. I could only go forwards in the grief and hope to come out the other side to something that still looks like a good life that's worth living. So every time you try and talk about that and somebody says, oh, you've still got time, or they're trying to drag you back through the door, they're just not meaning to, but they're telling you, I don't want to hear about this and I'm not with you. But they still want you to be excited about their new arrivals. And so just this huge distance was creeping in. And I didn't really know how to navigate it. And I tried, I got quite, so there's an online community that I joined and a book by a wonderful woman called Jodie Day. And the advice in there is to find a new tribe. And I remember joining this community and going, I don't want to find a new tribe. I have got friends that I've been friends with for years who have been by my side through all sorts of things, and likewise with them. Why does this need to get in the way of that? So I tried really hard to talk to them, and one or two were great, and some had really good intentions. But I think pretty much every conversation ended with some form of, okay, well, we've talked about that now, so that's that. We fixed it. You can either adopt or you can just put yourself out there, get on Tinder, you'll find somebody, everything's fine, stop your whinging. And that was the sort of feeling that I got. And these are really good people. And I want to say that in case any of my friends listen to this, I love them all deeply and they're wonderful. But there's just this block around childlessness that is really hard for people to understand. And I was guilty of that before I became childless.
Because the thing I'm really getting an insight into is, although the numbers of permanent childlessness, 1 in 5 women reach their mid-40s without children, and only 10% of those choose not to have children, and only 10% reach it through infertility, it's an invisible delegitimized loss. So what you were experiencing was a disenfranchised grief, wasn't it? That you were saying, be with me, hold me in this place, allow me to feel what I'm feeling, allow me to express it, hear me, support me. And what you got from people who really loved you, and it was their version of loving you, but it wasn't received by you as meeting you where you were at, was how to fix it, adopt, get pissed, make a baby with a stranger, go on Tinder, go to a sperm donor. So, but all of that completely missed this door that you knew was closed for you. This wasn't about finding a different route to having a child. This was you wanting to be supported, given that you knew now that at the age you were then and now, you were permanently childless. And that was what you were needing to grieve. That was a real experience for you.
It's a very real experience for me. And it's still a really real experience for me. My children just feel so real to me. I feel absolutely fine without having a partner, and I imagine I probably won't find a partner, at least not imminently. I'm not interested. I just want to go and live my life now. Finding a partner was really important for me in order to bring my children into the world, and that's over. So, yeah, my children, they feel very real to me. They always have. And with people not meeting me where I was with that, I think that was harder than the grief itself. And I think it's kept me in the grief for much longer than I've needed to be. And I mean the deep grief, I think the grief will always be there, but the really deep, heavy grieving process.
The heavy lifting of grief.
Yeah.
Tell me about your children that you grieve and miss. Do you have an image of them, a picture of them? It sounds like there's more than one.
I always wanted to have 3 children. I long, long ago chose 2 boys' names, 2 girls' names. My horrible brother took one of the boys' names for one of his sons, so that left me with 3 names. And I thought, well, I won't choose another one because I might jinx things. So in my head, my
So
children
interesting, magical thinking, isn't
are... Oh,
it?
totally. Yeah, in my head, my children are called Sam, Maggie and Bee. I don't know anything about them. I don't know what colour their eyes are. I don't know what colour their hair is. I don't know what they sound like when they laugh. But I feel them all the time.
Yeah. I can really hear that deep sadness of having their names, knowing their names, and yet not seeing them physically, not hearing their voices, not knowing in a more kind of embodied way their personalities. So it feels like an almost double grief, like you've pictured them and you've given them names, but you're grieving also that you didn't get to meet them and know them. Maybe does that
It
make sense?
feels, a couple of years ago, my dog and my sister's dog went missing, and they were down a badger set. We didn't know where they were, but we were pretty sure they were underground somewhere, and it was 5 days. And we were both obviously hoping that we would find our dogs, and stuck our heads down badgers' holes. We whistled in rabbit warrens. We did the lot, and we were both there together, waiting to pull our dogs out of the earth, out of these deep holes. And we did get them back. So that was the happy ending. With childlessness, that's what it feels like to me, that we've all got our children down these badger sets, and we're just waiting for them to come out. And so I feel like my children are as real as your children. I feel like they're as real as my nieces and nephews. They're not real to anybody else. They are so real to me. And to the point that I imagine when I die, they'll be there. And I go, oh, there you are, which sounds so ridiculous.
It doesn't. I can really picture them. And I was kind of, where I was picturing them was also picturing the kind of chilly loneliness of you picturing them and nobody else picturing them. So, because when you talked about your dogs going underground, you were with your sister and you did it together. So you whistled together and hoped together and cried together and prayed together, and you both knew what you were missing and looking for. You had an image of the dogs, names of the dogs, so you shared it. I think what sounds particularly almost crazy making psychologically is no one gets you. No one gets this experience, so you carry it completely alone, so it invades you, and that's when it gets stuck. Like, you feel if you'd been understood and heard and allowed, then probably it could have come through you in a way, you could have adapted, but it's like it's stuck in you because everybody keeps doing these quick fixes and in some way dismissing you.
That's all anybody needs to hear, really. You've just summed up the whole thing. Yeah, with the dogs, it wasn't just my sister. Our friends, our neighbours, parents, the whole family, everybody was out. Everybody was shoving photos onto Facebook and things like that. It was a full coming together, and that is missing. And it's missing. It's kind of missing all the time. Christmas, when our family gather together and my siblings are there with their children, but I'm the only one aware of who's missing. And I think with grief of a real person, there's some acknowledgement like, oh, I'm so sad that so and so is not here today, or you must be feeling that. But there's nothing, because nobody knows about them. Even though they know that I'm grieving childlessness, they don't feel a connection to my children.
I wonder if there's a ritual that you could introduce at significant times that in some way represents this invisibility. Because in your message to me, you said an unexpected route to healing has come through creativity and reconnecting with my true self and learning to let go of societal norms. It's both liberating and terrifying at the same time. Which is, there's another point to that I want us to get to, but I was thinking about your creativity, like using your creativity to create something that represents your three children that you can bring to birthdays and Christmases and family gatherings, so that you feel they're less invisible, that you make them visible in some way.
Yeah, I have. I have come up with all sorts of fun rituals over the last few years. My very lovely younger sister came with me into the woods one day. I said, look, I need to get these children out of my system. can we have a ceremony? And we gathered some limpet shells and some periwinkles, one for each child, and we stood at the bottom of a small waterfall together, and I read a letter to my children and floated these shell babies downstream, and that was a really beautiful thing to do with my sister.
That sounds so beautiful and moving.
Yeah, it was really special, and I go back there a lot, and I stand by the waterfall and feel like they are kind of there. And I brought some of the shingle back home with me and put it into some little mugs with tea light candles.
How
So
lovely.
there are
So
things
you
that
can
I've
light
done.
them.
I was thinking the other day that the number one thing that would help is if we could normalize some sort of ceremony for people like me. And I had the sort of the idea of bringing together those friends and family who would go along with it to actually have a proper ceremony or ritual, and to be welcomed into the world then as a childless woman, because
Yes.
it's such a huge identity shift that you sort of feel like you've been cast out of society as
Exiled.
a yeah, it really really feels like that. And normally if you're sort of cast out, you go through your initiation and then you're welcomed back in as a new mother or as somebody who can no longer walk or whatever it is. But when it's so invisible, you're never really welcomed back in as who you are, because people
I
don't really
find that
realize what a
so,
transition you've been through.
yeah, I find that so powerful and moving. And when you connected with the Facebook group or whatever group it was of childless people, it was a bit like you were saying, I don't want to be a group that is exiled. I value these people, of course, but I want to be integrated and have a representation and be acknowledged as who I am as Henry, who is childless. And it's not a chosen childless, it's a loss. So I don't know if it's the equivalent of a baptism and a funeral or, but some ritual that represents you coming back and being integrated and naming and not shaming, allowing, but acknowledging both the loss, the names of your 3 unborn children, and yourself as a fully kind of woman, because there's something about society that everything revolves around families and people with kids, and they have, they get to leave work early, or they don't come in because their child is sick, or for all the reasons that we all understand. But you're then left on the sidelines working over Christmas because you don't have children. I'm not maybe speaking to you exactly, but to lots of people who don't have children. And it's men too. I mean, you're particularly interested in women because you're a woman, but I imagine I don't know what the numbers are for childless men, but they certainly exist, don't they?
Yeah, they do. And the grief exists for them as well. Obviously, it's a lot harder for them as men to talk about that. And I don't feel like I can talk about it for them. But yeah, it's huge. And I think that word exile is really, really resonates with me. And it's how I feel still 4 years later. And I would say that in my psyche, I have come to the conclusion that I need to remain exiled in order to survive, because I've tried to get back into the mainstream, and I can't do it because I can't just shed the grief and be who I was. I've tried. So unless I can be welcomed in with the grief, I can't be whole. So it's better for me to remain exiled. And that sounds a really weird thing to say out loud, but I'm pretty sure most of the childless single women who are grieving or in that grief zone would probably say the same.
I don't think it's strange in the sense that grief is naturally adaptive. And so the task of mourning is to face the reality of the loss as we see it. And the single biggest kind of predictor of our outcome is the love and support of others. Given that we are grieving love, it's the love of others that enable us to survive. And accommodate our loss, begin to develop a new normal and engage with life, changed by our experience. And I think what you're very explicitly saying is, until I am seen as someone who is grieving and legitimately grieving this loss, how can I re-engage with life? Because people are seeing me as I was in my 20s, which is to have hope to have a partner and have a child. And that isn't who I am now. So whilst I don't want to be in exile, I need to be true to myself and who I find myself to be at 43, living in this world. And if you don't see me as I see me, then there is this gap between us that puts me outside of you.
Yeah, I don't even really know what to say to that, because it feels so right, and yet there is a resistance within me, because I know that I want to get back, and I hope that I can find a way to do that alone. But also, I think that the way to do that alone is to remain exiled in some capacity.
But I think this conversation is a way towards it, I must say. I was wondering about your creativity, of what supported you and what, given that you are grieving and it's an ongoing loss that is unrecognized and disenfranchised, what are the supports that you find within yourself and for yourself? You actually got up today and had a day that you didn't collapse.
I turned to paints a lot, and I think that was partly making it something visually representative of something that I couldn't necessarily say out loud. And painting gave me a way of giving voice to a lot of complicated, not necessarily feelings, but a general sense of place in the world and how this was all playing out for me. I remember early days drawing images of myself on one side of a river and everybody else on the other side of a river, and seeing them with their lives and that sort of thing. And that visualization helped to understand it myself. And then, yeah, I've done a lot of expressive painting. I think most people look at what I've painted and go, "Oh, that's angry," and I'm like, "Uh huh."
Dead
So
right
yeah,
it is, I am. I mean,
yeah.
you must be furious, no? Furious at all of it.
I think there's quite a lot of rage.
Yeah.
I
I
may
mean,
have
you're
beaten up a
laughing,
few
but it's
trees.
like,
Oh my god,
yeah.
it's literally like that. I have literally whacked trees with branches that have then broken and smacked me in the eye, and I have
Oh, God.
thrown rocks at rocks, and my dog's had a field day chasing it all. So
Yeah.
that's something. So yeah, there's lots of
But does that
artists now.
release you, the battling in the nature, the whacking a tree with a stick or a rock with a rock? Is that kind of, is there a release that comes from that, feeling the force of your fury whacking against
Yeah,
trees
yeah.
and rocks? And
I think that's the problem with the disenfranchised grief is you. I think it's probably a problem with grief anyway. But you feel like you're a container, and what's inside is expanding, but your body isn't expanding with it. So it's just coming out here, out of your chest, and you're like, oh my god, this has got to go somewhere. I cannot hold it. And then the rage comes out. And as soon as the rage is out, it turns to just pure griefy sadness, collapsed on the floor
yeah,
sadness. And then it's, oh, thank
yeah.
God, that's out. Okay, now I can move on with the day. So yeah,
I
yeah,
mean,
lots of
it's
that.
like it's a pressure cooker. The image you have of yourself is like this pressure cooker, and it just, and when you do release it, the rage is the froth on top that other people find indigestible and kind of frightened of, and they back away from you. So that's why you have to use trees and rocks and stamp and do it on your own. But once you're sad, that's more kind of socially acceptable. So I guess then people can move towards you. And that's one of the difficult things. I mean, there's so much of grief, which is rage and fury, but leaves you more alone because people find it threatening, because it's like, it's expressed. But with you, I can really picture your sadness like you become fetal, you become your unborn child in some way.
Yeah, I think they're all inside of me. That's a weird one to carry. Is like I'm parenting, although I'm not parenting, but I'm currently parenting all of the small me's who are so angry with me for not having children. and they are throwing proper tantrums.
Gosh, I can really picture that. These kind of tantruming 2-year-olds and 4-year-olds and 8-year-olds who want to get me out of here, let me be born into the wild. And I can't help thinking, because I'm a therapist, is there a direct line between them and a 2-year-old, a 4-year-old, an 8-year-old you that wasn't heard when you were distressed? Or so is there a young you that links to the wounds of them?
Yeah, when I was 5 months old, my father had a stroke. So mum and dad were gone out of the picture while he was in recovery. And at the time I was being breastfed. And I really, this happened, absolutely. I was walking through the woods and I suddenly just fell and started crying. And I knew 100% I was 5 months old. I had no doubt about it. I don't remember that. As I was crying, I was like, oh, this is my 5-month-old self who was abandoned, quite rightly, because dad was very ill, but who felt very abandoned. And I can
The
feel that
body
part.
remembers, the body
Yeah,
holds the score.
yeah. And then I had a tough time around about 10 years old, and that was to do with family financial problems and mum suddenly going out to work and his stroke, not being the best dad at picking you up on time from school, that sort of thing. And my younger sister was 3 or 4 at that point, so I was mothering her in mum's absence. And I I think I remember a feeling of just hold it all together, because one day you'll be married and you'll have children and then you'll belong and then you'll have your family and you'll be okay. And I think that she in particular is really, really very upset with me for not making that happen.
Yes, because it was another promise you made to yourself when you were young. Like that
Yeah.
young child said, "Don't worry, you'll get there. You'll be all right. Once you have your own children, everything will be fine." And so she feels, does she feel abandoned or disappointed or betrayed or left? What's she saying?
I think she feels completely alone in the world. That is the feeling now as well, because of not having the partner, not having the children, not having the support, feeling that exiled. It's not loneliness, like it's not loneliness to talk to somebody, and like an existential loneliness, a sort of feeling of being untethered. Like if you were drowning in the sea, you'd be the last to be rescued because you're nobody's priority. That sort of existential alone in the worldness, which the grown up me is can handle, but the 10-year-old me, she can't handle it.
No. I was wondering whether the adult you can take the 10-year-old you into your arms and tell her it's okay, I've got you, and take her into a kind of safe place, like it's all right. I mean, there's a reality, there's an untetheredness I get of living alone, that you don't have your person who's looking out for you and that you're looking out for them. So that's reality. But the adult you can cope with that, whereas a 10-year-old is, I'm going to die. And so I was thinking, a visualization I would do with you if I was working with you is sort of give that 10-year-old time to speak and say what she's feeling and what she needs and what she's frightened of, and kind of invite her to come towards you as the adult. And does she trust you? Is she a bit wary of you? And over time, building a relationship of trust where she comes with you and you take her to a safe place within you, which might be a beach in Cornwall or in your woods or by that waterfall, so that then she's not in that trauma place, basically.
Yeah, I've been working with a really wonderful woman, and that's a lot of what we've been doing, and it is really helpful, I think.
That's great. So we're coming to the end. Do you have I've really appreciated the honesty of your conversation and kind of how emotionally open you've been and where you're at. Do you have something that, if other childless women and men are listening, something that you think would be helpful for them to know that you've learned through this long, painful process?
I think that there is a different life ahead. And it might not feel like you're in it yet, but there's a transformation that you're going to go through, and it's going to be brutally painful, but it is going to open your soul in the same way that having your children would have opened your soul. And you will become truer to yourself, and you will live a life that you feel proud of because of it.
I mean, that sounds a really powerful vision and image of your kind of soul expanding that has hope, that as brutally painful as this is, you get to a place and the brutality has changed you and opened your soul and opened you to a place that you can be at peace with. Is that the right word? Or you can hold both the loss and the peace?
Yeah, I think I have ambitions for my life. I've been writing through all of this. I've written a memoir about this whole journey, which I'm now in a creative crisis about. I think I'm going to fictionalize it, but that's a whole nother story. But I have ambitions for that and for my life, and I want to do things that will help the women particularly who are following in my footsteps, because I don't want it to be as hard for them. And I hope that when I am ready to leave this world, all of those little me's that are inside me will say, thank you, we did it. And then that we can close our eyes and my babies will be there.
Oh, I can feel the tears in me, that the kind of picture of you, that you will live a meaningful and useful life with what you've learned, and it will help others, and so that you can in some way protect them from some of the worst aspects of what you've gone through. But those babies inside you will kind of acknowledge and be grateful to you for the life you've led together, them inside you, and that you will all die in peace. Is that what you're saying? It feels very poignant and very heartbreaking, but also beautiful.
I think, weirdly, grief is beautiful. It is painful. And we're really, really rubbish at it. We're really terrible at dealing with it, but it is beautiful. When you can find the meaning for it all, I think that's more valuable than anything else in my life.
That's a really beautiful place to stop, Henry. That grief is beautiful and it has a real depth of meaning, and there's something about the clarity of the agony of it also brings a huge amount of heart and love with it. It's like, as bad and as painful as it is also as beautiful and as that the love is. So it's a kind of two sides of the same coin. Should we end there?
I think so. I won't be able to hold it together much longer.
Thank you so much. It's such a meaningful, beautiful conversation. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me on.
Hello, Sophie Samuel. Emily couldn't join us today. Reminds me of book club. Like, you and I, we all meet so regularly now, and life happens when we meet. So sometimes people can come in book club, sometimes things are happening in people's lives, but it's still, the train still goes on, the book club goes on, and we still have to meet. And I really like that.
Yes, it's nice, the consistency, isn't it?
So we're talking about permanent childlessness, and I thought it was an incredibly moving conversation. I was so moved at the time, and then listening back, actually, I felt even more so. I don't know what came up for you, myself.
Yeah, it was really moving, wasn't it? And she so generous with her feeling. You know, you could really feel her pain in it. One of the things I was reflecting on, which is nothing new, but it was just one of those episodes, interviews, that reminded me just the importance of deep listening, truly listening to the other person's experience. Firstly, it can be just easy and casual to bring assumptions about what something might mean to somebody, but also how hard it is sometimes, for any sort of listeners out there, for friends, partners, parents. I think one of the great gifts of training as a therapist is in the art of listening. And I think one of the cornerstones of that is kind of noticing when it's hard to listen and being curious about what it is in your world that makes it hard to actually spend the time to find out what it's like for someone else. Is it just a practical thing? Do you not make time for really listening to other people? is it that somehow someone else's perspective feels like it threatens the choices that you made, and so you sort of don't truly want to hear their experience? Is it that you find it hard to tolerate the suffering of someone else and you sort of want to make it better because it's hard to hear it? And I think something, or is it something that they have a different view from you, different values? And all of those can be blockers to listening. And I really would advocate, just for human general well-being, for people to think about how they listen, to reflect on that, and for tolerance. I think sometimes we're in a phase, I don't know what you think, Mum, this is very much going away from Henrietta's
But
thing,
that's what we like to do. We like to go out and then come back in.
exactly. But we seem to be in an era of where tolerance is less valued than kind of having the right
Opinion.
view. And I think sometimes we're somehow in a phase where people feel culpable even to listen to someone who has a different point of view from them, to let them give voice to a view that you disagree with, or that you think is possibly ethically different to what the standpoint you take. And
I haven't thought of that. I mean, I love the way you start what you're saying with the art of listening and deep listening. And I actually haven't heard it described as that. And I think that is so true. And then as you're describing it, it's kind of really recognizing the preciousness of it, but what it does to us to be able to fully listen, to recognize when we don't want to, and to kind of know where we want to push back. And I think societally, that's such an important point, Soph. People are kind of constantly transmitting and needing to have an opinion, and can feel like maybe there's something wrong if they're just listening and allowing somebody else's view. And my goodness, we might be in a different place if we allowed lots of different views at the same time.
I know, and it just occurs to me that that's partly a sort of inadvertent consequence of social media. And I'm not just want to doing social media bashing. It's more that it's a platform for talking, not a platform for listening. Just as it's designed, you're meant to put content on there, and obviously it's to listen to, but it's not a, by definition you need to have something to say, and doesn't really facilitate the art, a point to make an opinion, rather than like a platform for receiving, listening to others.
And I think, to go back to Henrietta and to other people who have her experience, men and women who have permanent childlessness that isn't their choice, her deep, profound sadness was so alienated and unaccepted by others. They would dismiss it and like go and have a quick date, or go and get pregnant, or or show her scans, because thinking that she would really enjoy that. And I think the message I got was, again, it's to do with listening, but also like take a moment and try and get into the other person's shoes, which you get, the access is through listening, but it's like, put yourself down, step across, and think for a moment what this person is going through, and your whole attitude will change. And I think there's something about quick fixes that can be so agonizing to receive, and really just thoughtless.
And I think so often people are trying to help. That's what's sort of tragic about it, isn't it? Is that we want to help other people, and often we just get it wrong, because we think the thing we need to do is make it better.
Yeah.
When actually 80%, 90% of the time we can't make it better. We can only be alongside, can't we? And it made me think, a question that sort of comes up probably in different domains is, can you grieve what you haven't had? I think often people undermine the legitimacy of that, both in themselves or in other people. And absolutely, you can absolutely, in fact, I think a huge amount of grieving is what we haven't had. It's the father we wish we had, the mother we wish we had, the job or life or future, and in this case for Henrietta, the children she wished she had.
And
they
partner.
and partner and family. And that's not a lesser grief, but it's probably it's harder because it's less visible.
I wonder if there's something that we could identify about missing what you don't have that would help people understand it. It's about space, isn't it? And it's about the kind of your sense of identity, and often the dreams we've had or the pictures we've had for our life going forward. And they have they have become a kind of what we fully expected. And then there's this moment that can be, in her case, her 30s, where you suddenly get this grief shock in the shower. Like, oh my God, that isn't going to be me. And I've had many clients who said, I slept walked through my 20s or I slept walked through my 30s. And then I suddenly realized. I don't really have any kind of advice about how you can make sure that you don't sleepwalk or
go to therapy.
yes, that's a good point. But it's the sort of dream and the assumption, and then there's a gap in between of actually what you're doing to make that happen, like how you live your days, how you build your life, or that is your life. And I was thinking she'd made that decision, as many of us had. I'm not the next person I date is going to be the one, and unconsciously that influenced all her dates, but she didn't know it. And I think we've all made decisions like that. I'm not going to get hurt like that.
Yes, it's the power of the story you tell yourself about yourself, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's that sort of, lots of those expectations about the future are wrapped up in identity and who you are and who you think you're going to become because of who you think you are now or who you hope you become. And sometimes that's an inherited story, that we're living a story without realizing it, that was something that our parents expected of us. And so we sort of, without even knowing it, we sort of put it on and carry it. And then there's this devastating moment of realizing it was never what we wanted, or it was actually, we never went through the process of,
deciding,
in terms of, I guess,
choosing.
Yeah. And I think it's one of those ones actually where I would say, your mum, you're like, well, what could help? And obviously there's no one answer, is there? But I do think connection to the body is helpful. I think having a time to attune doesn't need to be in therapy. It can be in any way. It can be on your own. It can be in meditation, be in a walk. How is it all actually feeling? Like, how is it actually feeling? Like, we can drive, when we're driven by the story, we're often driven by the head, and we're not so connected to the experiential, like, am I actually enjoying, is this really how I want to spend my life? It's like, if I check in,
like your inner wisdom,
your sort of intuition, your body, your feeling state.
You're much better at that than me, so because busyness is the thing that disconnects us from our feeling state. So I'm like a little hamster, and you're,
and I get a lot less done. It's a big trade-off.
I don't know if you get less done, but I mean, if I stop, I can tell you what I'm feeling, but it takes me a bit of time to go in. Whereas I think you're leading from your internal wisdom, don't you? You lead from internal.
Gosh, that makes me sound rather highbrow. I also think, though, I don't know what you think about this, Mum, is that I think people just have natural rhythms. This is not based on, just to be clear, academic information.
Tell us,
this is personal theory of the sort of, just that there's an inner rhythm that feels comfortable. That, like, and I think I have a slow inner TikTok and you have a fast one. I remember, and I can't remember who told me this, but that there's a couples therapist that, those metronomes that you play for music.
Oh yeah, for piano.
And she would get the couple to play the metronome at the pace that felt most comfortable for them. And I've always, from those ones that someone tells you and you store it away because it clicks. And I was like, yeah, my metronome goes tick, tock, tick.
I love your metronome.
And I think your metronome goes tick tock, tick tock, tick tock, tick tock, tick tock. And that means when you're in a situation where you have to, in my case, when I have to go fast, it feels very stressful. And in your case, when you have to be slow. And there's obviously lots of things that feed into why our inner pace rhythm is like that.
Yeah.
And I remember when I was having cranial sacral therapy, which I found really helpful. And he was saying to me, he was like, you can only go at your natural pace. There isn't any other. You can obviously make yourself go faster than what feels comfortable. But in terms of well-being, the only good choice for someone to make is to go on what feels good.
And to kind of take this broader, linking to Henry and to linking to the stories we tell ourselves,
Mm.
is when we're in our family, we begin to kind of look at our differences from our siblings, from our mum and dad, from our grandparents, and you can decide that I'm going to be like them and aim for them, and that can go against your internal actual instincts about what you're going to do for a job or how you're going to live your life or where you're going to live, because you're so wanting to belong to the tribe, because we have such a instinctive need to belong and be the same. And so I think what we're talking from a kind of insight point of view is there can be such a pull to go outside of what your internal wisdom tells you, and to listen to both, because I think we need both, really. You need to belong and you need to allow yourself to be who you are.
And that reminds me, in terms of Henrietta's experience in a family, but also societally, isn't it? Is that some people are, when you do sort of fit in, often your story is more visible, more talked about, more comfortable. I mean, if your story is different to cultural expectations, family expectations, then you can feel like you've become invisible, or
She
that
talked about it as an exile, that she felt
yeah,
completely exiled, and until she felt allowed to grieve these children who have names, Sam, Maggie, and
yeah.
B.
Oh, they really made me cry, actually, that bit.
I know, that made me cry.
Yeah.
She wanted to be welcomed in as she was. And Jodie Day's written this book about childlessness, helped her so she could find a tribe. But we do need to find a belonging, but also bridges to the people who we need. I
And
completely interrupted you there, by the way.
I didn't even notice.
Okay, you're so used to it.
No, that's not true. Yes, I'm wondering if there's more on that note. I suddenly thought, are we going to risk going through the podcast without truly talking about childlessness?
Okay, let's do that. We must.
Um,
It's interesting, isn't it? I mean, unconsciously, that we've just gone round the houses and we
mm,
haven't actually talked about that.
about permanent childlessness, which the sort of profundity for her, since it wasn't by choice, the profundity of the grief. It's a whole reorganizing of self, isn't it? I guess it's one of those shocks to the system because it influences her whole imagined future, isn't it? Of old age, of all what it's all going to look like.
I mean, I think it's a evolutionary drive is to have children to survive, that, we are wired to procreate, to survival of the species. So I think there's a kind of evolutionary aspect to it. There's definitely a societal norm to it. And as you said, as we have talked about, is the version of ourselves we imagined of being a parent, and then there isn't that role. But also there's the fear, like I've talked to other clients I've had, like what's going to happen to me in old age, like who's going to look after me, who's going to care for me, if my partner dies, who's going to love me. And also finding meaning, because many of us find meaning through building relationships. I mean, many of us find meaning through parenting and the love we have for our children and the future that they have. So, I mean, it's almost limitless, the grief I think she's experiencing. And the work is finding a way of acknowledging and allowing that and expressing it, which she does through arts, which I think is incredibly helpful. But also finding a different meaning that enables you to have purpose and connection in your life.
Yes, it's that dual task, isn't it? Of both one not wiping out the other, both being allowed to grieve and hold on, and that be a legitimate loss for her lifetime, and still enable yourself to build a new life around this new reality that you don't want. That's what's so hard about this kind of grief. For many of us, it's not what you wanted. And there's this resistance to actually finding new meaning and finding new connection and new story, because it's not the story we wanted to have.
Yeah, that's a good point. That it's much harder to embrace it when you're still resisting it. And I think that's the power of what maybe people can take from this conversation, is that coming to the point that she knew she wasn't going to have children then did open a door to a different way of meaning. It was extremely painful, took a long time. She thought it would be just one shower grief strike, and it's taken years, and it's lifelong, as we know with grief, that it's an ongoing process. But without that, she wouldn't have found the connection to herself and where she is now, which is important.
Absolutely.
So on that note, I really thank Henry for her openness and for, gosh, such a powerful conversation. And thank you to everyone who is listening. And we love it when you can share these conversations with others and rate and subscribe so that others can find us. And look forward to being in your ears for the next conversation.